Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the April meeting of City of York Council's Children, Education and Communities Policy and Scrutiny Committee. This meeting is remote and broadcast live on the Council's YouTube channel, I believe. So welcome to anybody of the members of the public, anybody at home that's watching, and welcome to all the members of the committee and officers. I will do, and happy belated Easter. I hope you've all had some kind of restful, pleasant few days, and back to winter. I'll do a few introductions because I know there's a couple of new officers with us this evening. So for their sake, the members of the committee here tonight are myself, Rosie Baker, Chair, and Vice Chair Bob Webb. And then we have Councillor Heaton, Councillor Fenton, Councillor Dobany, Councillor Barker, Councillor Fitzpatrick. And we also have Executive Member for Children Education, Councillor Orrell, and Executive Member for Culture, Leisure and Communities, Councillor Smalley. So I would also just trying to find everybody on my view. I want to see everybody full screen. I can't actually see everybody at all. Okay, here we are. So Amanda Hatton is here, and she's a corporate director of Children Education, and Charlie Croft, Assistant Director of Communities, and Joe McKelly, who's a Senior Officer, and Maura Scaife. And they're here to join us on item 2, which is about community hubs. So I think I've probably mentioned everyone, but I am struggling to see everybody and cover everything. But we will begin with any declarations of interest for any items on tonight's agenda, please. If you would like to raise your hand to speak, do so now. Councillor Fenton.
Thank you, Chair. It's something that's on my declaration of interest, but just for sake of transparency, just say I'm a trustee of Foxwood Community Centre, which gets a mention in the agenda item 5 when there's a discussion about community hubs.
Thank you, Councillor Fenton. Councillor Webb?
Yes, likewise, I am a trustee at Tang Hall Community Centre.
Okay, thank you very much. And, oh, no, Councillor Orrell. No, sorry. Okay. And I should have said, for the people watching at home, there are 2 new officers. If you see them on the screen, we're welcoming Sarah White and Joseph Kennelly, who are City of York Council Democracy and Scrutiny officers. Okay, so item 2 on our agenda tonight is to approve and sign the minutes of the last public scrutiny meeting, which we had on the 5th of January. So do any members of the committee have any matters arising or things that they'd like to say about the minutes? Yes, Councillor Webb.
Thank you, Chair. On page 5 at the bottom of the report, there's in response to a question from yourself, the Chair, Corporate Director advised that a toolkit for children and young people presenting with harmful sexual behaviours has been created. I was wondering if it says here the Chair welcomed receiving the update report following its completion in April. Does that mean this April? And if so, have we seen that, or are we missing something? Or
no, that's the exact point that I was going to bring up, actually. The update report mentioned in that paragraph is the York Safeguarding Partnership biannual update report, which I believe we are awaiting, and maybe Amanda can just let us know if it's going to be ready this month.
You're breaking up really badly. I don't know if it's my connection or yours, Councillor Baker, but
probably mine.
So Lenton Brook is the business manager for the Safeguarding Partnership. So it would make sense to double check with her. And I don't know if that's something that you could pick up.
Yes, that's absolutely fine. I can do that. Yeah, I am aware that I keep getting a notice saying that my internet connection is unstable. So just keep me informed, please. And if I need to log on via my phone, I will do, but let's just plow on. So were there any other points of interest from the minutes at all, anyone, or shall I just approve those now? Can't see anybody indicating. Great, thank you very much. Okay, good. And moving on to, which I think would have been public participation, item number 3. Sadly, there are no members of the public registered to speak tonight. So that's that. Moving on to number 4. Now, there should be the author of item number 4's report, Richard Hartle, joining us. So sorry, I didn't introduce you at the beginning, Richard. There we go. So item number 4 is the Q3 financial monitor for this directorate, for all the services falling under responsibility of this committee. So, Richard, are you wanting to introduce your report, or should we just go into questions?
I can give a brief introduction if that's okay, Chair, and then move into questions and comments.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, so as you said, it's the third quarter's report. So this is looking at broadly looking at income and expenditure up to the end of December 2020. So as usual with these monitoring reports, what you've got is a subset of the information that went to the council's executive in February that looked at the full council third quarter. I think the key summary details are on page 9 of your agenda pack, the table 1 on that page, which shows that at quarter 2, the previous quarter, we were projecting about a £2.6 million overspend for the children, education and communities portfolios. And at quarter 3, that's increased by about £1 million. So that projection has got £1 million worse in terms of the year-end projection at quarter 3. The main reasons for that are almost entirely within the children's social care budgets on the general funds side of things. Where at quarter 2, we were projecting some reduction in the number of placements and the associated costs before the end of the year, and also a reduction in the number of agency staff that were needed to be employed in that area. And those two things haven't come to fruition as much as we would expect. We expected when we did the quarter 2 monitor. So that's why that projection is that much higher at quarter 3. The other things I would just point members to, just so we don't miss it in concentrating on the general fund, is that on page 13, particularly around paragraph 15, provided some more information around the dedicated schools grant, where again we're expecting a significant overspend in the current year, and particularly the deficit, the cumulative deficit on the dedicated school grant is expected to be just over £10 million by the end of this financial year. So that's clearly something that we need to be looking at and addressing in the coming months and at least over the next couple of years. And there's a little paragraph about that at paragraph 15. I think that's probably as much as I would say on introduction. So happy to take comments and questions, either myself or the director or other colleagues who are on the meeting will hopefully be able to answer those for you.
Right, thanks very much, Richard. So yeah, I will take questions from members. If you can raise your virtual blue or yellow hands, and then if you have a supplementary question, just to raise your real hand. And the first person was Councillor Fitzpatrick.
Well, thank you for this. I have to say, it's extremely worrying. It doesn't make a good read at all. I mean, we know mitigating circumstances, but we're not in a good place, really. The positive bits, I suppose, if I'm right in saying this, are that we're looking at MASH, for example, an external review has confirmed that decision making and thresholds are now appropriate. I'm still very concerned about the 3 areas that are mentioned later on in this. I mean, I'm going through the whole thing, I suppose, but I'm talking about children in care, and it's the out-county placements. It's the appropriateness of young people in specialist placements within the city. It's also, I suppose, I think at some point, just an actual review of where we are with Danesgate, exactly what's happening there and who they're taking in and how that's changed in relation to conversations that we were being told about over the last year or so that were going on with Fulford. I know things have moved on and we've had a pandemic. I just feel it's quite sort of worrying, really, but out county, anyway, if we can look at that. And the difference here between 38 weeks and 52 weeks, I think that's good. I think that's positive, obviously. But once, presumably, you know, and once we're talking about 38 weeks, we are then talking about children in care with foster carers. 52 weeks indicates that there are no foster carers and that they are there full time. So just a bit on that 38 weeks to 52 weeks and what we're doing there, if I can ask for a bit more information on that. And again, out county, if I can know a bit more about what we're doing. And I suppose it's same old in a sense. We're always trying, and this isn't a criticism, it's true of everywhere. We're always trying to reduce out county, but you know, currently, where are we on that? Thank you.
Okay, so I mean, there's quite a bit of work going on in that area, isn't there? And I think I see Amanda's popped up onto the screen, and she'll probably have some comments on what's happening there. And clearly, you mentioned that the pressures that we're reporting financially are of a significant concern, and that's clearly down to the increase in the numbers of children that are having to be managed through this system and creating those pressures. So, you know, just to clarify, I think we probably mentioned this at previous meetings, but you know, the budget itself is probably factored around that range that we talk about in paragraph 5 in terms of the number of looked after children, between 190 and 210. And you know, it's gone up to I think a high point of about 287 during this financial year. So clearly that's what's driving those financial pressures, both in terms of the cost of those placements and also in terms of the pressure on the staff who are actually having to manage that number of children in the system. And those two things are the things that are driving that pressure. So we do accept it financially. It is a worry. Do you want to comment on the work that's been done, Amanda, on the out of city placements?
Yeah, in terms of Danesgate, that's a slightly different issue because for those watching at home that don't know, Danesgates are pupil referral units, or our alternative provision. So it's education provision, it's not residential provision. The inclusion review has looked in its entirety at the provision that we have around children with additional needs. So it might be that committee wants to look at the inclusion review because that will pick up Danesgate. And you might want to invite the relatively, I want to say, new head teacher of Danesgate, but he joined us at the start of the pandemic, which doesn't actually make him that new anymore, does it? But you might want to invite Mark along to the committee to talk about some of the changes that have been going on at Danesgate, because he's been doing fabulous work over there. So I think that would be a positive one. In terms of out of city placements, a couple of things on that. Clearly, committee members will know that there is a national review in relation to the supply of residential provision, particularly because there is a national shortage of residential provision. So there has been a review commissioned through central government. Josh McAllister is taking a lead on that, and there is a number of consultation activities in relation to the really significant issue, which is a mismatch between the needs of children and the availability of placements across the country. Same is true of special educational needs and disability services. And there is an imminent SEND review awaited in terms of the publication of that, and we've had discussions about that previously as a committee. So notwithstanding all of that, what are we doing in York? Well, one of the things that we've done a lot of work on is enhance our recruitment of foster carers, and I'm really pleased to say that this year we have got 10 new foster carers, who are going to be foster carers for all of our children, not related to a specific family, so they're not connected carers. That is a significant increase on previous years. I think last year we had 3, so that's really good news that we've got that rise in foster carers. And many thanks to many of you who were part of this meeting, because you've been involved in promoting those recruitment activities, and that's made a big difference. The other thing that you'll know we've been doing, because we talked about this before, is actually looking at all the children that we've got in placements that are outside the city, and working with our partners around who can we bring back into the city, how can we develop placements for them, how can we make sure they've got the right education provision around them so that they can safely step back. But also working with young people around what support is it that you need to enable you to be back in York if that's where you want to be. And we have had some significant success in moving a number of children back into the city and into different kinds of support and provision. It does remain a challenge because of the context of that national challenge around the availability of placements and the nature of need that is out there at the moment.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I'm just going to jump in with a quick supplementary on that. I think it's fantastic you've recruited 10 new foster carers, but just to help me understand, if we had 10 more, how fundamental are the foster care placements and more of them as possible to the drive to bring costs down? Is it a real key part? And if so, what can we do to incentivize more?
It's a massively key part. Foster care placements, Rich will have the figures at his fingertips, but foster care placements are significantly cheaper than residential placements. But more importantly, foster placements are typically within York or nearer to us as a city, and also are a more usual environment. Most children live in families. However, there are some children for whom their needs are such that they're not able to live in a family environment at this point in time, and they need specialist support and specialist provision. So there'll always be some children and young people who will need that kind of support, and we will always make sure they get that kind of support. So it's not that if we had 300 foster carers, then we wouldn't need any residential support, because there will always be some children that do. But what's really important is being able to plan for those children around, well, when and could they step out of residential provision into a family environment. So some of that is around thinking about different kinds of foster carers that we need. So one of the things that we're doing is looking at people who may have worked in broadly children's services, who might now be at the end of their career and thinking actually they'd like to be foster carers. And they might want to act as carers for older young people, for example, because that's an area where, what people that want to foster teenagers, there is a smaller pool for people in that area than there are for those that want to foster younger children. So we need very different kinds of people who want to be foster carers. If anybody is watching the meeting who is interested in being a foster carer, please do make contact with us. Check our Twitter feed, check our website. There's lots of information around being a foster carer on there, and we would very, very much welcome your contact.
Thank you very much. That's really useful. And next question is from Councillor Heaton.
Thanks. I think this one follows on really. Looking at the foster carers with vacant placements, obviously we're bringing new foster carers in, which is excellent. We need to keep pushing on with that, and particularly when we're talking about the different needs that are out there. I mean, there's a page 14, paragraph 19.3 in the report talks about a review into these vacancies. Where are we with that at the moment?
So I think that's basically, I mean, that's an ongoing exercise across the directorate. And, and to be fair, we've probably been doing this through the whole of the financial year because we knew things were tight at the start of the year. So you're talking about the temporary staffing contracts, or have I picked up the wrong point?
I think it's
19 point, the one below that,
one below
local
that, sorry,
foster carers, yeah.
Foster carers. Okay, that's probably one more for Amanda. Sorry, I've picked up.
I can't get the document to open up on screen without losing all of you. But essentially, what we do every time, or what Sophie does as the assistant director every time she has her service meetings, is look at vacancy rates in foster care, look at who is available, look at who is becoming available, and then matches children to those placements. So we have a tracker, which is looking at where young people are currently placed, what needs they have in terms of their future placement, so that we can start to do that matching early. So that if we know, for example, a child's going to leave a particular foster placement because their care plan is that they're moving to a different kind of placement, then we start to plan around who that placement might be the most appropriate placement for, that they can move, so that you have that kind of constant flow in the system. There will always be some level of vacancies within foster care because they happen for a whole host of reasons. So foster carers typically are approved for a specific number of children, but it may well be that, so say a foster carer is approved for 2 children, but it may be that they take a placement where a child can't be in a placement with another child for a particular reason. So they will have a vacancy, but it won't be a vacancy that we would currently be using because it's not the right thing for the child that's in placement. Similarly, carers may need to take some time off for personal reasons, may want to take a break between placements. So there's always going to be a level of vacancy within your foster carer group. What's important is that kind of dynamic management of who's in placement, who's likely to move, and making sure that you match the children's needs to the placements that are available.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Councillor Fenton, I think you were next.
Thank you, Chair. Just a question on paragraph 13 on page 12. It's the home school transport. And it's sort of fairly clear from reading this that the main pressures are arising as a result of post-16 and post-19 young people. The one bit I didn't quite understand, and it read to me as though there was potentially a perverse incentive to place people out of area, which I'm sure isn't the case. But the sentence begins, the main increase in numbers have been at post-16-19, where because of the city now being able to provide more specialist education provision for this group of students more locally, subsequently we have had to provide more transport to establishments such as York College, Ask O'Brien, Choose 2 and Blueberry Academy. I just wanted to check that it wasn't the case that had those young people been placed out of York, we wouldn't have had to provide the transport. I just wondered if someone could clarify my understanding.
Yeah, I think that will depend on the type of provision that's been made. So if it's residential provision out of the city, then there won't generally be a transport element, or the transport element will be much smaller because it'll be at the start and end of that placement. Whereas generally, if we're placing young people more locally, then that will be provision that they're travelling to on a regular basis each day. So that increases those local transport costs. But overall, we would expect the overall package of care to be less if we're able to have those local placements. And there's also the slightly added complication, which isn't helpful in terms of the way the funding for these things work, that the costs of those placements will be funded generally from the dedicated schools grant, but the transport isn't. A lot of the transport costs have to be funded from the general fund. So if we, making the placement cost a little bit less expensive, a little bit cheaper by moving those placements more locally, we can make savings on the DSG, but we increase costs on the general fund. But generally, overall, cost to the public purse would be a little bit less. I think it's probably the general point that we're trying to make there.
Yeah, no, that's fine. It's helpful to understand the interaction between reduced placement cost because it's not residential provision that we're commissioning, but the flip side is an increase in transport costs because of the placements being non-residential and local. That's helpful, thank you.
Thank you. And a question from Councillor Webb.
Thank you, Chair. My question is about paragraph 5 on page 10, and it's about the recalibration of the system. And I think it's worth highlighting the fact that yes, there is a sizable overspend, and we need to look at that. But actually, there is a sizable overspend because we've got more people, more children in the right place, in the right kind of care, and I think that is a positive step. But my question is about those children, that if they weren't in care when they were younger, and I recognise that throughout the report and throughout previous conversations we've talked about the fact that we have a larger cohort of older children sort of in the care proceedings essentially than is typical. If we've caught these children in a way, we've sort of recognised as an issue, the thresholds have been sort of dealt with, and now we've got a large cohort of children who are a bit older. My question is, would those same children been picked up earlier? Normally, if things had been different in the past in York, or would we have potentially prevented them from going into the system in the first place, if we'd have known about them in the first place? Does that make sense? It's quite a confusing question. Amanda, you might be able to answer it.
I think what you're saying is,
have a go.
Have we got more children in care because there was drift and delay in earlier stages? And which is a shorter question, but an equally challenging one to answer. I mean, that's a difficult question to answer, because you don't know what the circumstances of those children would be. You know, it's kind of asking you to predict. But what we know is early intervention, really focused intervention, really good care planning, really good quality assessments is more likely to prevent the need to becoming a child in our care than if the assessment isn't strong, if the early care planning isn't strong, if the partnership working isn't strong. So, and it's also typical for authorities that are in the kind of improvement journey that we are, that they see an increase in their numbers of children in care, and that increase is the last to start to come down. Because obviously once you take the child into care, you're their parents, you're their corporate parents, and you will continue to care for them till such point at which it's no longer appropriate for you to do that. So that recalibration does typically see a rise in children who are in need of protection, so those that are subject to child protection plans, and a rise in children in your care. And then typically the numbers of children who are in need of child protection plans come down first, and then that means that the number of children who are likely to come into care significantly reduces as well. And that's exactly what we're seeing. Our numbers of children who are in need of protection are now at or slightly below our statistical neighbour average. And that means that the number of children who are on the edge of care or at risk of coming into care has reduced significantly as well. The numbers of children who are in care are starting to come down, but obviously, as I said, that's slower because we continue to care for those children who we already care for. That makes sense.
Go ahead, Bob.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that does, Amanda, and it's very costly to care for these children, but obviously it's the right thing to do. That then sort of leads me to a follow-up question. I'm glad that we've got both Councillor Smalley and Councillor Orrell in the room, because hopefully you two can help answer this. We don't want to get into a situation where we continue to have this really costly expense at the end of the process, where we've got children in care. Even if it's the right thing to do, we've got to spend the money, but it's tough, it's expensive. So I suppose for you two as exec members, so what budget planning is going in almost now, in advance of next year's budget, to look at preventative work, because we know that that's a lot cheaper and is much better for the children we're talking about. And I suppose, yeah, I particularly highlight Councillor Orrell because I suppose it is more your area, but in terms of communities, Councillor Smalley, it probably fits under your hat a little bit. So I was wondering if either of you could give us an idea about
that. Shall I come in first, Rosie?
Yes, do, thanks.
Yeah, I agree with the whole tenor of what you're bringing through, Councillor Webb, in that dealing with children at the earliest stage possible is the best thing to do. I go back to my career in special education for slow learning children, where I was in a special school, and if we got the children at 5 or 6, by the time they were 11, they were in a position to return to mainstream education. If we got them at 9 or 10, it very rarely happened. So you're absolutely right in your premise that we need to help children as soon as possible that we can. In terms of budgeting, we haven't started the budgeting for next year yet. That comes in the next few months, but certainly it'll be part of the rationale for the budget going forward, that we continue what Amanda's been doing for the last however long she's been here, 2 years, in developing things for children as early as possible. I think the national thing is the first 1,001 days, which is part of the movement going forward on a national basis as well as a local basis. So yes, we'll be developing budget in that sort of area over the coming months.
Councillor Smalley, did you want to add anything?
I'm not sure there's much I can usefully add other than to agree with exactly what Councillor Orrell said. And I think if there are, I mean, obviously Amanda and her team are alive to this in terms of, especially from a communications perspective. And I think what we've seen is as the councils started to communicate a lot more throughout the pandemic, we've seen actually how the responding to the virus emails to residents are now filtering. I've seen several resident emails now that have mentioned, for example, fostering, but other provision that's around. And yeah, I agree with what Councillor Orrell said. My mum's a primary school teacher in a school that every other year has over 50% EAL, and yeah, in an environment like that, you obviously have to do an awful lot of, as you said in your statement, Councillor Webb, prevention is always better than getting to a situation where you need intervention, and as you highlighted, also more cost effective.
Thanks, Councillor Smalley. And just before you come back, Councillor Webb, I think this committee has identified that we would like to at some point do more work on the early help strategies, and the multi-agency approach for early help is something that we could definitely look at in more detail. Did you want to respond, Bob?
Yeah, no, I was pretty much going to say that. And yes, Councillor Orrell, you do have the excuse that you weren't quite in this post at this point last year, I don't think. So I can let you off the hook for that one. But I do think it's one that we, if we know it now, we should have known it for a long time, but we definitely know, and it's been highlighted here, and it's something that we want to look at as a committee. I'm sure we'd have some thoughts to feed into that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Webb. Next question was from Councillor Heaton again.
Thanks. Just turning to page 10, paragraph 5, looking at different elements of that. When we're talking about reducing numbers of children down to acceptable levels, I mean, we're obviously talking there within, the parameters that we've previously spoken about. Obviously, we've spoken previously that we're not going to be taking children out of care for the sake of statistics. Everything's going to be individual. But I was wondering if we could just have an update on where that progress is in terms of, we're going to have the natural turnover, obviously, but where are we in terms of the development? And obviously, you've got the permanent strategy, which I'd like to follow up on, once we've done this one, if I may.
Do you want me to pick that one up? Our statistical neighbours, so not the regional average, would suggest that the numbers of care that would be typical for York is round around 230, 235 children and young people in care. And as you rightly say, we are not ever going to make a decision about a child's life that is based on money and not on what is right for them. So if a child needs to come in care and they are the 236th child, they will come into care. If they are the 260th child, they will come into care, because it is our duty to make sure that we safeguard them, and that's the right thing to do. But as we've just said in terms of the conversation previously, what we do need to do is make sure that all parts of the system are around preventing that need to come into care as much as humanly possible. So we are, as it says in the report, doing a lot of work on MASH, which for those that don't know what a MASH is it's a multi-agency safeguarding hub, which is still relatively new in York. It was established a year ago, last August, so it's kind of 18 months or so that it's been in place. And that is about that first point of contact, what kind of support you get and the intensity of the support that you get from all of the different partner agencies. And that's also about how do we work with all of those agencies that are in communities, all of those people in communities, to support families before they need social work support. And as it says in the report, the external review of MASH was really positive, that it was a positive addition and it was working well. So that means that people get support of the right kind earlier and also in a more focused way. So what that is doing is reducing the number of children that are coming into services who will then need to become looked after. There will always be some children that will need to become looked after, but the numbers have significantly reduced in that area. What is also important to note is that looked after children, or children who are in our care, looked after children is old language now, and we should talk about children who are in our care, don't always live with one of our carers. So we have a number of children who we support and we share parental responsibility for, but who actually live with their family, with their birth families and with their parents. And quite often that happens because they are transitioning from being in a placement back home. So they are still included in the number of children, but they're actually living with their parents. And that's a real success story. But clearly, that's a delicate and detailed piece of work. And what you don't do is have a child in placement, move a child back home with their parents, and then walk away. You maintain that support. So, in short, the numbers of children who are coming into the system and who are likely to need care are reducing. Because of that kind of tracker that I talked about before, we are much better now at good quality care planning and at planning when children can step into different kinds of placements, and therefore have a number of children who are, as I said, at home placed with their parents, who we will be going back to court to seek a discharge for those orders, so that those children no longer are in those numbers. Their lives won't be significantly different in that they'll be living with their parents still as they currently are, but they're not included in those numbers. It will take us time to bring our numbers down to the same level of our statistical neighbours, so that kind of 230-ish. And what we're seeing across the country is very different impacts in terms of how COVID's impacted on numbers of children in care. So some authorities have seen very, very significant increases in their numbers. We haven't. Our numbers have continued to go down during the pandemic. Where we have seen an increase is in people accessing early help support. So that's really positive, and that backs up that people are getting support earlier than they were before. But we don't know what the impact of the pandemic is going to be longer term. There is some modelling that's being done nationally, and we are using a central modelling tool, which is looking about demand in the system. It doesn't look at numbers of children who will need to be in our care, numbers of children in need of child protection services. It just looks at how many children are likely to need a social worker as a consequence of the pandemic. And it is interesting to look at the impact of lockdown and the impact on referrals. And that might be something that as a committee you want to look at in the future and get somebody from business intelligence team to come along and look at how that modelling works, because that won't tell you the magic date on which, you know, we'll have X number of children in our care, but it will talk you through some of the work that's being done nationally around what do we think the pandemic will do to some of these numbers.
Thank you. I mean, just one follow-up, if I may. I think we talked about the trackers element there. I mean, the thing you mentioned there about going back to court for those discharge orders. I mean, we've talked previously about the delays in that process and there being a bit of a bottleneck there, really, with some improvements. I mean, where are we in terms of development in that area?
Yeah, again, I mean, you know, that bit of service continues to improve. We're getting some very positive feedback now in terms of some of the work. We've got some very complex cases at the moment that we've had some really good comments from the judiciary around, you know, the kind of improvements. It's still an area that we need to do work on, and it's still an area we continue to work on. We've expanded the size of the team that works in that area. So we've increased the capacity. We've got more experienced social workers in that bit of the world. So, you know, we're still on that journey of improving, but it continues to improve.
Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Amanda. Councillor Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Chair. Basically, a few things. I don't want to take too long, though, because I know we want to move on at some point. Just following on from Councillor Fenton earlier about homeschool transport, I think, you know, Amanda, your idea of us talking to the Danesgate head would be really, really helpful, actually, to look at where they are now and how the pandemic has affected things. I sit on education appeals, so I know the kinds of justifiable anxieties parents might have about their children sharing transport during pandemic, which will have added to the concerns and the growth in people wanting a separate vehicle per child, that sort of thing, which can make that expensive. So certainly talking to Danesgate, and obviously the other one is Ask and Brian, but Danesgate in the first instance would be very useful. Looking at page 11, number 7, the last sentence there, just if I can be clear on that, it's slightly confused in the way it's written, but just it means obviously that, I assume it means that the more foster carers we're getting now, foster carers coming through, are going to help that 38-week to 52-week placement, because obviously it's good that we're looking to have more people nearer to York to get away from 52-week placements. So that must be, I assume, am I right in thinking that that will be more foster carers will make that happen? It is one thing. And the last question, if I say them together, they can be answered. Communities and equalities, looking at number 12 there, the contribution made to the head of culture and wellbeing post at Make It York, for which there is no budget provision. On that now, given that Make It York have had a one-off payment from the council very recently, that will change, will it? That one-off kind of contribution. I wonder if Councillor Smalley can maybe explain that. That won't be an ongoing thing. And I realise, obviously, communities and equalities is moving, but it just struck me as strange that that had been there from last time. Okay.
Councillor Smalley, do you want to just answer that last point?
Yes, and if I could just declare an interest, obviously I'm a director of Make It York, which is on my register of interest, but I don't think that stops me from answering the question. In a sense, yes, Councillor Fitzpatrick, you're absolutely right. Obviously, when that post was created, and I think it's proved much needed, as it came just before the pandemic, yes, it was in essence half paid for from CYC. And I understand the goal to be to obviously include that within the overall format of a renewed SLA and contract, so that, as you say, it's, you know, you get the whole picture rather than you know, an SLA with then things bolted onto it. So yes, the tenet of what you said, I think we all agree with, and in the coming months that'll be rationalised.
Thank you.
And Fiona, could you just reread the line that you wanted to clarify about foster carers?
Councillor Baker, I think I've got it. It's the 38-week.
Top of page
question.
11, the last sentence.
Yeah.
Children. It starts off children in residential. It's a long sentence. I just want to be clear what it means.
Yeah. So what this means is, it's I realise I didn't answer it before, Councillor Fitzpatrick, because you did ask before, so apologies. What this is about, and it goes back to that point I made before about we're trying to recruit different kinds of people who want to be foster carers. Some foster carers care for children all day, every day, for long term. What we're looking for is some children are in residential provision or in residential school 52 weeks of the year, and that's where they live, that's their home. But for some of those children, we think that they would be able to have 38 weeks in a residential school. So they'd go to residential school, but in the holidays, they could live in a family environment. So we're looking for people who would want to be foster carers to those children as well. So that would mean you would only look after those children during that holiday period. So quickly doing the maths, the 14 weeks a year, that is the difference between the 38 weeks and the 52 weeks. So again, if there is anybody out there that would be interested in being a foster carer who would like to care for children, not full time, but would like to care for children in those holiday periods, then again, please do make contact. They would typically be children that would have some level of special educational need, potentially some disability as well. It would be wonderful if people wanted to get in touch with us about looking after some of those children, and it would be a hugely, hugely rewarding thing to do if anybody is interested. So please do make contact.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. Councillor Webb, final question perhaps on this item?
Thank you, Chair. Hopefully it'll be a quick one. Paragraph 17, which is most of the way down page 12. Last sentence says, education psychology is predicted to overspend by 72k, mainly on staffing. Well, is that we've had to get an extra member of staff in to deal with things? What's the reason behind that being quite a way away from what we would budget for?
I think I probably need to check that one out, Councillor Webb. I'm not sure of the exact reason, whether that's having to get in temporary staff to cover vacancies or whether that's an additional member of staff. I'm not sure of the answer, but one of those two, and I'll have to find that one out for you. Apologies.
Thanks. Okay. Brilliant. Great, interesting set of questions there. I just had one quick one as well, actually, I remembered. Page 14, paragraph 19. Bullet point 4, one of the mitigations is to continue the restrictions on all discretionary spend. And I just wondered whether that includes the discretionary free school meals system that York does very well at, being able to award discretionary free school meals to families who aren't eligible for the government's free school meals. Is it at all related to that, Amanda?
I don't think it is related to that. I think it's more the more sort of general budgets that budget holders would have at their discretion to spend. So equipment budgets, that type of thing, travel budgets, all those type of budgets that generally that budget managers have, that we were just asking them to think exceptionally carefully. And clearly in the year that we've had, there's probably less need to spend in a number of those areas. So we're really expecting people to think carefully about it. It's more those type of things that these sort of normal managers that are managing a team of staff would have at their discretion, I think is what we're referring to there particularly.
Right, I see. Okay, I just wanted to check that and hoped that it wasn't impacting on discretionary free school meals. That's good to know. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for being here, Richard. And what we will do, if we get a chance later in our work plan item, any outstanding things such as early help or the permanent strategy that you mentioned, Councillor Heaton, we can look at where we can slot any outstanding things from the discussion just now into our work plan going forward for this committee. So without anybody else wishing to speak on that item, I think we can move on now to item number 5 on the agenda, which is the Community Hubs Scoping Report. We asked for this as a committee back in November, I think, and Charlie Croft and Maura Scaife have joined us this evening. Is Maura there? Yes, she is. Great. To present their report about a proposed scrutiny review of the way in which the council is intending to roll out a community hub system, which began with some, as we heard at the beginning, Councillor Fenton's involvement with Foxwood, the Town Hall Centre, Red Tower. Community hubs began a few years ago in a response to tackling, increasing financial inclusion. So we'd very much like to have a bit of an intro, if you can, Maura, to the things you've brought to us tonight in the report. Then we will ask questions on that scoping report, clarification questions. We'll then look at the really useful section that Charlie, I think, has written on how we might like to ask questions in a scoping review. If members want to proceed with that, we'll have a discussion about that. And then if there's any outstanding questions on the annexed paper about the funding of community hubs, we can look at those as well. So Maura or Charlie, would you like to introduce your report? You don't have to.
Very happy for Maura to say some words, as you suggested, Chair, about perhaps the origins of where hubs first came from. I think that would set the scene nicely if Maura would like to do that.
Thank you.
Okay, so I suppose we're casting our minds back now to about 2016, I think, which is where the idea for the hubs first came out of a piece of community work looking at a potential funding bid. It was about looking at reaching out to people, that reach into communities to connect people to services that weren't naturally finding that support and those services in order to support themselves, and indeed peer support within communities. And as you quite rightly point out, initially it did have a financial inclusion emphasis to what we were doing. And I think what we learned from that process going forward was that a holistic approach was needed, that people need something that they can trust, that they can relate to very locally. If traditional services or coming into an office or that sort of building or space wasn't what did it for people, helped them to connect, then we needed to create something that was. And it was very much a ground up, given that we did go out to a couple of communities. We did start very small. It was just about, if we opened this up, who will come, who needs support, and let the community drive that initial project, if you like, to look at developments of a community hub. And very quickly we realised that there was a great deal of need out there in terms of connecting to services, especially around benefits advice, around debt advice, but also, just as importantly, about health, about well-being, about family matters, about all sorts of things. So each place that has started a hub has really started from its own starting position, if you like, about what local needs are and what local people are saying that they need. And when we talk about hubs, I think one of the really important things for me to stress at that point is that it's a real partnership about working with what's already on the ground and then looking at gaps and trying to find ways to support those. And the peer support within communities is much more important than anything else in that process, I think. So it's not about just a model that's dropped down within communities and everything looks the same. The hub in Foxwood looks very different to what goes on in Red Tower, looks very different to what might happen somewhere else, or might happen in Haxby, for instance, or a different area. And the emphasis in one area might be that financial support, and somewhere else it might be very much the health and well-being. So very different model. Was really developing some traction on the ground and lots of interested partnerships. Not least, it gave services an opportunity somewhere to drop down locally and make those local connections, and also provided that focal point. I know hub almost feels like such an overused word now, but a focal point for the community to go and find those services and or company in lots of ways as well. So very informal, but there's having the services sitting behind, if you like. So those were getting some real traction, and we were looking at rolling that out, and we spelled out how we thought that might happen, what needed to sit behind that in terms of sort of networking across the city. There's a lot of great networking that goes on already, but just about reinforcing that and making it easier for people, and making sure that across the city it's about being connected rather than not being able to do what you do just because you know who you know. So trying to make that really happen and foster that community strength and that community development. And then came the pandemic, I suppose, is the way to look at that. And our approach to hubs had to turn on its head in lots of ways in order to offer an emergency COVID-19 response, and they became virtual. Again, a bit of a strange term, but I suppose in that, from virtual, I mean not front-facing, so not a publicly accessed service inwardly, but hubs were created across the city that could deliver out the services that people needed to sustain themselves during the pandemic and network across with other groups. Is that enough of a potted history?
Yeah, thanks, Maura. Just quickly, a clarification question from me. You talk obviously about the networking, and I noticed I'm bringing groups together, and of course that's so important to everybody understanding and knowing who's out there doing what. Page 19, the community centres network, well established and well respected, you've written there. Could I just ask, is that something that is still functioning, and who does it consist of, and have they already been part of or consulted on the New York Community Hubs model, or I presume that group would be in the future if they haven't already been involved?
Absolutely. I think a few of the people that are at this meeting tonight may have been at a meeting where we all got together when we could physically to talk about hubs, about networking, about how we work to support each other across the city. There is still a community centre network. There is also a network amongst those that have been working through the pandemic. A lot of the community centres, a lot of others got together to talk about other things outside of that formal process. So there's lots going on that we're still connected in. I suppose more now it's about looking forward about how we work through that transition period and bring all of these elements back together in lots of ways and make the most of what's happened so far.
Okay, thank you. So I'll open it up to other questions, and Councillor Daubeny has his hand up first.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just wonder more, for the sake of those people watching from home, obviously perhaps less familiar with the way that the operation is currently going on with the hubs. Could you just say a bit more about how virtual hubs have been able to help communities in these very difficult times? Kind of down to specifics really, what people have needed and how we managed to help them during the pandemic.
Certainly, thank you, Councillor Daubeny. So I suppose it's been phases. There have definitely been phases of the different types of support we've needed, but some of that real basic support. So access to food, access to medicines through collecting prescriptions, delivering food, doing shopping for people. I mean, it's not always necessarily about just providing something. Other people might want something quite bespoke. So we've been doing shopping for people, and then they've been recharging. People that can't use internet shopping, for instance, that can't access that or couldn't get supermarket slots. We've been doing a lot of that work through volunteers. So the hubs sit with members of staff within them that are doing a lot of the calls, assessing what the need is, talking to people, and then a lot of the actual physical going out and about is done by volunteers that are connected to those hubs, and they've been absolutely fantastic. So the main sorts of support in terms of essentials, if you like, has been food and medicines, but also about connecting people into services. Actually, the pandemic has brought forth a lot of people with needs that maybe wouldn't have contacted a service previously. So it's about all of that knowledge within our organisation and supporting people to access the support that they need. A lot of that well-being type support. So we've made an awful lot of phone calls is what I say. We make a lot of phone calls to people. If it's a one-off and somebody doesn't need our support, then we move on. But a lot of people we've had regular calls with, and built up relationships with those people. There's elements of trust. They might then bring forth other issues that they're facing that they might not have ever brought up to anybody previously. A lot of that looks forward towards what might come next as well, so that we can help people transition back into getting out and about again. We've supported quite a few people with conversations about the first time that they leave the house, maybe to go to the shop or where they can access certain services. We've connected them, we've signposted them to others. So a whole host of things as part of our response. So yes, just recently, for instance, the period from Christmas, I think we've been ringing up to 11,000 people during that period that are registered as clinically extremely vulnerable. So we have that as a baseline, if you like, that we've been contacting. Also those that are shielding and safe isolating, and then those that are just struggling generally that have come in through the COVID support helpline or email.
Thank you, Maura.
Thank
That's
you.
very helpful. Thank you.
So, Councillor Heaton, your question.
Thank you. Just in terms of the development offer, so page 19.7, the third bullet point we've got there, it talks about the existence of or potential for the development of a community group. Now, existence of a group is fairly straightforward, but what are we talking about when we mean the potential for one, and how do we sort of measure that? How do we go about saying, well, this is proof of the potential, or, you know, how's that all going to work?
I think the pandemic's a really good example of that, where there's a need that's been identified. People have come together to be able to develop that, and a lot of them are now thinking, what are we and who are we, so that they can go on and access funding. So I suppose it's very, very similar, Councillor Heaton, in that respect, where we might go and start something, see what the need is. Like I said, you know, the first one, I think we opened the doors and put the kettle on. As people come forward, then either an established group might say, actually, I can really see the benefit in this, I'd like to be involved, or people that come and seek support could come together and be supported to develop themselves to create a community group or an organisation that could then take that forward. That's the idea. It's not about us dictating or mapping something very distinct onto that area. I think more it's about quality of support and quality of offer, and helping people to deliver that.
Targeting, essentially, I think we're looking at. I mean, it's obvious, you know, when we're sort of going in and we're looking at these sorts of areas, and, you know, people here will have done similar things when we've been out speaking to residents. Yeah, we can identify support there. And when we're sort of going in and people are, you know, coming to us, as it were, when we're having that sort of like proactive reliance, what are we going to do about communities which, you know, perhaps are, you know, less eager to be engaged initially, more from a point of, you know, they don't feel like they're actually going to be able to make a difference to something? How are we going to be able to go in and, with this system, actually engage them?
I think there's a couple of things there, isn't there? There is that, it sounds very simplistic, but just start something and see what happens as part of the team, if you like. But also there's that, I just lost my train of thought there, Councillor Heaton, I'm also awfully sorry. But also, yeah, that's where I was going, sorry. Each community we've already worked in, or each place that we've already worked in, has gone at its own pace. Some have been extremely quick to set up, and people have jumped forward and said, yes, I can see this and I can see the merit in that. And others we've stuck with for a very long time, in knowing that it would come eventually, because the need was there and the community were there, but just having sometimes just enabling people to have the confidence to step forward is one of those really big things, isn't it? It's about investing in people and investing time. I think that's why it's not a one-size-fits-all model, and it can't go at this faster pace. If you think about it, it's got to reflect the needs and the capacity within that community at the time.
So this is something then, I'm assuming, that you'll be relying on, people on the ground, councillors, to actually try and drive the enthusiasm there in some way.
Absolutely, and there's a real role for everybody in there, but particularly ward members and ward teams. I mean, that's where you can have some of those multi-agency discussions, isn't it, about what could happen, and put out the call almost about where we see a gap.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Heaton. So moving on, Councillor Fenton.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Maura, for the report. I think just picking up on some of the points that Councillor Heaton raised in terms of sort of where to start. I think certainly from my experience, looking at what currently exists and what's available in not just in your ward, but in your part of the city. And I was noted in the report, it talks about a community hub for each ward, not necessarily in each ward. Obviously, all our wards are different. Some are sort of remote rural wards, some are densely populated areas where you move from one ward to the other without necessarily realising you've moved from one ward to another. And I think it certainly what the last year has sort of taught me in terms of it is to be less hung up about location and more hung up about what you're offering and how accessible it is. Just a question for Maura in terms of the report talks about the intention being to resume the rollout of physical hubs in whatever form and at whatever stage there may be. To what extent have you kind of over the past year kind of rethought how we go about doing that? To what extent has our approach changed? To what extent does it need to change to reflect what we've learned in the past year in terms of what our assumptions were around the rollout of physical hubs then to what we know now? How different a rollout is it likely to be given what we've just been through?
Well, there's a couple of things that I would respond there. That it'll be a mixed response, because one of the things that we'll be looking for going forward is we will be re-establishing some of the existing hubs, or they may have developed during the pandemic in one direction. So looking to re-establish and help them to get going again. There's a lot of intelligence on the ground, isn't there? So mentioned ward teams and ward councillors there, but also we've been telephoning an awful lot of people, like I say, so lots and lots of discussions on there. We know what sort of requests have come into the hubs about what people are struggling with, whether that's pandemic or beyond. We work really closely with the local area coordinators in terms of that walking alongside people. So some of that more in-depth knowledge about the challenges that people are facing, I think, is there. So I think it's a phased response, not that one thing can't go on without the other. So we would look to re-establish where we already had something that was working very well alongside the guidelines. there are new opportunities that have sprung up where people have worked together that may have been the component parts there before, but all of a sudden have been working together a lot tighter. And I think there's some real opportunities there. And also there are going to be gaps across that map, aren't there, where you're going to think actually that there isn't something there, and we know that there's a significant issue X, or we know that a lot of people have brought forth these issues, and we need to have a look at that. So that's how we would plan a rollout.
Thank you. So I think it was Councillor Webb next.
Councillor Heaton, did you have a supplementary on that one?
It was a brief supplementary if yours was a
sorry,
major
I
question.
missed it. Go on.
No worries, no worries. Plays into sort of what Councillor Fenton was mentioning there about the one for each ward as well, which is something we've obviously spoken about. I think, Maury, you sort of went on to the lines of it as well towards the end of your answer there. I mean, when we're looking at this, obviously it specifically references one for each ward. Will we also be able to look at areas where there are larger wards from a geographical standpoint with different communities, which are going to have very different needs across them? I can think of just in Holgate, we've got two sides of the railway line with very different communities there. Are we going to have the flexibility and the ability to put something like that together?
I think because it's an ethos, then that's almost in your gift as ward teams and ward councillors, isn't it? To look at how you develop anything outside of, not outside of, alongside and in partnership with this rollout. There's got to be a balance at some point, and we've got to follow the need. But yes, ideally there'd be one on every corner almost, wouldn't there? You'd never go very far without hitting somewhere where you felt that was part of your community and you could walk through the door. But that's quite yeah. Sorry, Reynolds.
Thank you.
Yes, Councillor Webb, go ahead.
Cheers. I've got a supplementary on that one now. And then I'll ask my major question, because I've got my chance. Firstly, Maura, you have worked your socks off over the last couple of years, and I think we should really recognise how much work you've done, because it's been fantastic. You genuinely have pulled out all the stops and worked, I should imagine, more hours than you've been paid for. But anyway, my question is, following on from what Councillor Heaton said, I mean, I imagine we're developing quite a map now of actually where the need is across the city. And I imagine, I'm no expert and hoping you can help me by answering this, but I imagine a lot of that need is in the city centre wards, when we're talking about, access to food, access to, finance advice, things like that. And I suppose a problem that we have is it's written within this report that actually using ward budgets as appropriate to fill gaps in local provision. Well, our ward budgets are obviously based on number of councillors, not need within the ward. And so I'm wondering is how can we join the two together? Because I think it is going to be something that potentially is a problem. Hopefully we could get to a system where we could look at how things work across boundaries, which would be great. But right now our ward's funding structure is based on whether you've got 1 member, 2 member, or 3 members, and obviously somewhere out in rural West will have very different need to Clifton, for example. And now my substantive question, which follows on quite nicely from that, is there is a commissioning fund that's been approved of 70,000. And I suppose the question there is, what is the actual mechanism by which that is accessed? How is it that is going to be sprung into action? Thank you.
There's 2 things there about mapping. Well, first thing was about mapping, wasn't it? And I did mean to throw that into an earlier response about that local intelligence on the ground, the mapping both of the need that has come up, but also what's already there. There's a lot of mapping has gone on over the last couple of years, not just in the service area that I work in, but with the local area coordinators, with children's services. There's a lot of mapping going on there about different types of need and different types of need across the city, financial, loneliness, health. There's a lot of things, a lot of them cross map, and obviously that helps to identify areas, doesn't it? But different places bring different challenges and different needs. Absolutely. In terms of the commissioning fund, when we first put that together, put that forward, was sort of October, November last year, looking at the anticipation that we would be in a transition period on that road to easing lockdown after Christmas. That was the idea initially, or our thought processes initially, but obviously that's gone on a lot longer than we thought. This is more about, so now we're sort of 6 months behind that curve, if you like. We're now looking at that commissioning fund has always been about recommissioning and developing the hubs and that rollout, but also being able to commission what services that we need to support people once they're up and running, and you know, what is it that we're seeing when we go out there and talk to people that we haven't got and that we can't steer in from other places. So I think that's the connection between the two. But sorry, Councillor, did you want me to talk about anything else in that? Did that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it started to. I think it is. It is. How do we? You know. So us lot as a group of councillors, we noticed that actually loneliness is an issue in wards throughout the city, and I imagine whether you're in Weldrake, Westfield, or Heworth, I couldn't think of another W one, that loneliness will be an issue. Yeah.
Yeah.
How would we say, right, Thunderbirds are go, that we need a citywide sort of commission, and we need to do something across the piece on that? That will be my question. And then potentially for Councillor Smalley, who I think was keen to jump in, this idea of there being some pretty extreme needs in some of our city centre wards that might need that extra bit of support. How are we going to sort of deal with that?
Okay.
If I may, Chair, I guess. Oh, sorry, I'll go after Maura.
No.
Oh, okay. I know. Firstly, to agree. Firstly, to agree exactly with what Councillor Webb said about Maura Scape. You know, I think often your faith is knocked in councils, but you know, colleagues and officers like Maura, and also Charlie, obviously, with you being here, really do restore. If you ever, do feel your faith is knocked in local government generally, it's people like Maura and Charlie that renew it. And yeah, God knows how many hours above and beyond you've worked over the pandemic, but our thanks will go to you. I think not to sort of throw the question entirely back into the committee's core, but this is, I guess, the sort of thing that this review could look at in greater detail than we'll be able to discuss tonight. And I guess, and it goes back to what Councillor Heaton said about geography and communities across wards, and some wards, including mine, you don't have one central focal point where everyone in the ward would recognise as the centre of the community. And I think looking at what goes on in other cities and what's provided and what works and what doesn't would be an important part of this review. Additionally, I guess, and as we've tried to be honest and open in terms of, I guess, the link with ward funding within the scoping paper, not going to pretend it's not linked. I mean, I don't know of many authorities left that still have a ward funding system. Of those that are left, I don't know off the top of my head any that are linked in an actual way, in a proper way, meaningfully, in a meaningful way to levels of deprivation. But for instance, looking at that would be interesting. I still, defend, I guess, the system we have in York, but I know, not to reopen all of that. And yeah, happy to pick up other points outside of this meeting. But I think, I mean, that absolutely doesn't answer what you've asked, Councillor Webb, but it hopefully means that, this is, I guess, why we're sat here discussing a scoping paper tonight, is is that, you know, we're not, myself, Maura, Charlie aren't sat here with a blueprint of how we want this all to work in great detail. I think actually that work is coming out, and every week it's shaped. I think we've seen, sorry, I'm now rabbiting, but we've seen some community centres on their knees after the pandemic. We've seen some that didn't exist. It's not necessarily infrastructure, but some groups that didn't exist before, and it's a real mixed picture across York, and what we go on to do needs to reflect that and build on what's there. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Councillor Smalley. And just before you come in again, Maura, I am aware that because of the COVID Recovery Fund, that as ward members we are going to have funds specifically for people coming to us and asking for projects and ward funding to do with COVID recovery. It would be good, and I think it's either ready or you've started sending this out into all ward members' inboxes, I think, some advice and guidance about how to use that COVID recovery fund for some of those really essential needs. Is that right, Maura?
Absolutely, and that should help discussions within ward teams going forward and looking at any applications that come your way. And, you know, the offer is open to further support those discussions.
Thank you. And I think we have a question from Councillor Fitzpatrick.
Yes, I wasn't sure if you'd seen me with my hand up. I was going to come on with the supplementary before on Moira. I've known Moira a long time, and particularly over the work at Red Tower. I didn't declare an interest before because I'm not a trustee, but I'm in the process of becoming one. I've resisted being one for a while because I felt as a ward councillor I could do more otherwise. But anyway, so yeah, you've done a lot. And I would agree with everything that Councillor Smalling and yourself are saying about the development going forward. And certainly Councillor Smalley knows my concerns about ward funding, specifically as it relates to Guildhall, because it is just, our needs are so diverse and the types of requests we get for funding are so diverse, and they're not really, and they're across the city as well. So absolutely think that we do need to have a review of what's going on. And I think, Chair, if now I'm at the end of it, if I can move us on to the next bit, having previously attended the meeting with yourself, Councillor Daubney and Councillor Webb, on mental health, it's quite clear to me that you've got that in hand. There's no need for 4 of us to be on there. I think 3 is enough on a group like that. So I'm happy to sort of put myself forward to be on this group. I think it's very necessary. I'm particularly interested in looking at national things that are going on. I think that's a really good idea. No point reinventing the wheel if we can look at good practice elsewhere. I do take on board the fact that obviously until we get into the autumn, we're not going to be absolutely clear on social distancing and what we do. But all the questions that have been asked are very pertinent. Everyone tonight has raised all the things that we need to ask. So I'm just saying I'd like to be part of the working group. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, brilliant. Oh, that's really good to hear. Thanks, Councillor Fitzpatrick. And that has very nicely moved us on to looking at the proposed scope of review, which is on page 22. And you've mentioned, Fiona, that you think all of the questions on there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different questions, you know, ranging from the backgrounds, research, to then some more local questions. And following that, there's some brilliant suggestions for review activities that us as members could go out and carry on with, possibly later in the year, exactly, if we're actually going to go and do visits and try and have meaningful observations and conversations with other people in other towns. You know, that would be fantastic. The best way to learn is from experiencing it and going, spending a day in somebody else's community hub, of course, and bringing back your learning. So can I just check, firstly, is everybody happy to go ahead with a review? And are there any, put your hand up now if you think there's any of those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions that people don't think is necessary, or a brand new question to throw in there. Oh gosh, right, hang on, I need to check who was first. It was Councillor Webb.
Yeah, Councillor Fenton. Yeah, no, I think they're all 5 questions are very good, and I really welcome this review into hubs. I think my point would be about question 5, so that's on page 23, about halfway down, which is develop proposals on how ward members could use ward budgets most effectively to support hubs and complement their use. I don't disagree with that bit. I wonder if we need to, on that funding bit, we need to add something in. Now, this might be a separate question or just part of that. And I'd say that we need to look at how proposals about ward funding are allocated in the first place. I think talking about need versus number of councillors, I think is important. And on that basis, then following on from what Councillor Fitzpatrick said about Guildhall Ward, that's a ward that contains an awful lot of charities because it's got a lot of buildings and offices and things like that. Therefore, a lot of charities might go to Councillor Fitzpatrick and the other Guildhall councillors when actually they're serving people out in Rawcliffe and Holgate and wherever. So there's 2 things there, I suppose. Is there something we could ask about training for charities as to how to write funding bids to us, and how they, because we've got lots over the last year where it's come to all councillors, and actually it's very difficult to work out. Sometimes we're not going to be able to afford it. So there's an addition to that would be, I think we need to look at that question of how ward funding is allocated in the first place, and secondly, is there an opportunity to both train and advertise ward funding with charities and community groups, so they better understand how it works. I think that might be helpful, and who to ask for what.
Thanks, Councillor Webb. Could we just ask Charlie and or Maura, does any of that already go on in terms of training charities and community groups in what the ward budgets are for and how it's allocated? Do we already do any of that?
I'll answer because Maura Pitt seems to have disappeared, has she? Oh no, she's there, sorry. I couldn't see her, she's moved on the screen. No, I don't think we do it as a formal training provision. I'm sure individual CIOs absolutely will help individual groups, but the suggestion to make this part of a review question sounds a very sensible one in terms of beefing up that aspect of it, I would have thought. But now I can see Maura is there. I'll let her answer after all.
Not sure that I would. There have been in the past almost awareness training sessions, if you like. This is how it works. This is how to apply. These are the sorts of things we need to see. As Charlie says, individual CIOs will work with groups and organisations in their area to support them to complete an application with the sorts of information that we need and the supporting information. But no, certainly something to consider going forward.
Okay, right, thank you. Did you have a supplementary, Councillor Webb, or is it a new question?
No, I think my hand's just been left up.
Okay, right. So, Councillor Fenton, comment from you about the scope of the review?
Thank you, Chair. Just on point 5, where it says ward members, I would probably be inclined to reword that to ward teams. In terms of creating an environment where it's not left solely to the councillors in terms of how funds are best invested, but if we've got ward teams on which hopefully will be some of the organisations that are potentially active locally and potentially bidding for funding, I think if we can make it ward teams, then it it creates a I think a more accurate reflection of how, certainly in my mind, the system should be working in terms of it's those conversations between councillors and local volunteers and organisations in terms of identifying, from the very basic point of working up your ward priorities, because that should be the starting point that should inform the decisions, and to some extent inform the applications that you receive. Because if someone applies for funding for a scheme that is totally unconnected, excuse me, to the stated ward priorities, then that's really where we need to be to be sort of very clear as to, well, what are our priorities as a ward. So I think broadening it from ward members to ward teams would be helpful. I think in terms of bolting on a review of the allocation methodology for ward funding, I think that would be, to my mind at least, an entirely separate piece of work, and I wouldn't want to bolt it onto this, because I think it could detract from the scope of this work, and I don't think it would. I think it could be a distraction. I think it's a debate on which some members have very, very strong views, and that's I fully respect that. But I think trying to bolt that onto this wouldn't be helpful, and so I wouldn't support going down that path. Thank you.
Was that a supplementary, Councillor Webb?
Yes, it is. I think if we want to talk about an entirely separate look at ward funding and how it is allocated, then I'm totally in agreement. But that is something that does keep getting batted away to a certain extent, and I think it is fundamental to community hubs. When you could have a community hub in Clifton where there is absolutely dire need, and there is going to be an awful lot of need, and you could do some brilliant work there. But if through no fault of anyone here, the funding is only going to come from the ward councillors, then it obviously makes sense, and it appears to make sense to look at that allocation of funding in the first place. Otherwise, Clifton will run out of money first. It's things like that, I suppose, that links into it. So I can see it being quite a big thing, Councillor Fenton, and I agree it might be worth its own separate review, and chair, if you want to think about that'd be great. But I do think it's something that is fundamental to the funding of these community hubs.
I suppose one of the things that a review into helping the officers and Maura's team roll out a post-COVID model of hubs, one of the things that might come out of it is, well, actually, there may well be different types of hubs in different wards or different parts of wards and different communities, and they're not all going to be funded the same. And I think I very much agree that where some hubs might have an ongoing need for core funding because it also matches one of the council plan's essential need for commissioned funding going forward in an area of deprivation, and perhaps has a local area coordinator attached to it, I would hope. That would be very different to some other hubs that have found ways of being self-sustaining, perhaps with a social enterprise model, and ideally be sustainable from the bottom up, and not be reliant on council funding from wherever that comes. So yeah, I mean, that was going to be my main point about the next item, well, the continued discussion on the agenda about how different hubs are funded for different needs. So I think the question number 3 which is about how ward members can best assess and evidence their local need, and perhaps establish a community hub if needed, would go alongside how that need was going to be met. So I think how you assess your need, and then how you're going to assessing your need, and then how you're going to meet it with what funding and why, and whose priorities are they and why, will come out of those two questions, 3 and 5. Does Councillor Fitzpatrick want to comment?
Yes, I do. I had my hands up as a supplementary before as well.
Oh.
Yes, I certainly feel that we do need to look at ward funding. I think Councillor Webb is absolutely right. I mean, it's got to the point now where it's just so confusing, and takes up such a lot of ward councillors' time, particularly if you're in Guildhall. I'm sure other city centre wards too. There's such a great deal of need, and it's not based on need, as we know. So whether or not it's part of this review or not, and I do take the points that Councillor Fenton is making, maybe it needs to be separate, but we absolutely do need somewhere or other within the council's working to look at ward funding and how it's allocated. That is very important. But setting that aside, just to go back to something else Councillor Fenton said about ward teams deciding and being part of the discussion. I think they are anyway, but I don't think you're suggesting that the decision wouldn't be made by ward councillors, are you? Are you saying, Councillor Fenton, that the final decision on the spending of the money is still with councillors, with taking on board what people in the team are saying? Thank you.
Just come back on that, Chair. Yeah, I agree,
Sure.
Councillor Fitzpatrick. It's yes, I mean, each ward will have its own approach, but in terms of looking at this wording, how ward members could use ward budgets. Yeah, ultimately we have ward team meetings, we discuss applications, but then it falls to the ward councillors to decide. I still see that as our ward team's budget rather than the sole preserve of the councillors. And again, I think it's important. I would expect the ward team to hold me to account as a councillor if I'd listened to the feedback, and if we had applications that bore little relation to the ward priorities, I would expect the ward team members to hold me to account in terms of saying, well, we've got agreed ward priorities. Why have some applications been successful and not others? So yes, I agree with what you said. I think picking up Chair, some other points. I think this piece of work will be helpful in terms of taking forward the discussion around ward funding and its use and its allocation. So I think this piece of work in itself could be helpful as part of that discussion, which may well lead to a further piece of work. So I think we should take advantage of this opportunity with a hubs focus. And I'm sure it will tease out some issues and some opportunities and some problems potentially that we should try and capture. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Fenton. So, is there anybody else alongside Fiona that is initially willing to start allocating, would like to sit on this task group, whether we start thinking about it over the next few months, or at least write a final remit and then kick off actual activity in the autumn, as has been proposed in the paper, is up to the members, I suppose. Would anybody like to raise their hand or show an interest in working on it with Fiona? Councillor Fenton. Was that a yes?
Yes, I'd be delighted to work with Councillor Fitzpatrick and anybody else to take this forward and really starting as soon as is practicable. You know, whilst there are sort of limited other opportunities to go out and do things, and even if we could start a literature review and do some of the sort of desk-based work, then in the spirit of Scrutiny being member-led, I'd be happy to get cracking.
Yeah, and I think there's an implication in the wording of the paper about how that desk-based work can obviously begin as soon as anybody is ready, and should be done, I would imagine, in conjunction with Maura's team, so that there isn't any duplication. Would that be right, Maura? Yeah,
that would be exceptionally helpful. Yeah.
Okay. And yes, go on, Fiona.
Chair,
Yeah.
Can I ask as well where we would be with this? Are we talking about help from Democratic Services at all? Are we in terms of writing anything, or we're not at that stage yet? Are you talking about us working independently on this, or what?
Right. Well,
does Ange know, or how it's anticipated that it will be?
I think I could answer that, Chair.
Oh, can you? Right, Charlie. Yeah.
Yeah, there isn't a resource in Democratic Services anymore to support scrutiny reviews.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
So we have to manage amongst ourselves. But I mean, clearly this is a mainstream priority for a mainstream executive and council priority, isn't it? And therefore, you can expect a full officer support from myself and Maura and Joe and the team to carry it out.
So we'll have to write it, is what I'm asking, I suppose.
But there will be officer support to do that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. And just so that for transparency, we are, as you mentioned before, Councillor Fitzpatrick, undergoing the youth mental health review at the same time, without any specific democracy officer support, although resource even, although I presume from what you've just said, Charlie, we might get some kind of support for doing that one as well, and may even be able to get some collaboration with health scrutiny on that one. Councillor Webb, did you want to say something next before we?
I was just going to say, Chair, are you going to sit on this group as well? Only poor Councillor Fenton and Fitzpatrick on their own, just two of them. I mean, they can go and fight it out in a room somewhere, that's fine. But I just think sort of three people might work a little bit better. And I don't know if you were going to get involved or you want someone else to.
Well, I don't know really. I don't want to just do it because I'm the chair. I will do what I can to be involved, and would also be very happy if any other member wanted to contribute, sort of as an addition.
I'm happy to stick my hand up if that's the case then, and sit on if everyone else is happy with that.
Brilliant. Thank you. Okie dokie. I mean, yeah, I'm more than happy to convene an initial meeting and try and contribute to research and things. But do you know what I was going to say is, depending on how we decide to proceed with our involvement in youth mental health, that will, and our timescale for doing that one, could change which review I have more available time for, and we can have a discussion about that. I'm just,
Chair, can I say that I do feel from experience over this, and I'm sure Councillor Fenton's the same, 3 is a good number, actually.
Yeah.
Once it gets beyond that, it's too much. So if we're saying we've got 3 now, Councillor Fenton and I mean, I was thinking, Councillor Webb, I know is extremely busy as you are, but if we've got Councillor Webb then, so that's the 3 of us, basically, Chair. I'm sure we can convene our own group, really, although your offer's very well intentioned. I'm sure we can probably organise ourselves if that's the 3 of us then.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, Councillor Webb. And in terms of ward budget allocation, I will leave it to the three of you to have a discussion about refining that fifth question. And
poor Councillor Fenton.
Well,
would that maybe work better as a sort of separate discussion between me and you, Chair, about how we fit that into a future agenda? I take on board what Councillor Fenton said.
You know, whether it's something that directly comes under this committee's remit as just us around the table today, or whether it's something that actually all ward members should be consulted on. You know, I don't want to speak for all ward members on that, but I suppose if we can move on to work planning, people can throw in their ideas as to whether they would want that on the work plan going forward. Councillor Fenton, Fitzpatrick.
Yeah, I think what Councillor Webb just said actually is extremely helpful. I'm more than happy to leave it to you, the Chair and the Vice Chair, to discuss that and come up with something around that for the future, really. Right, we don't all need to be involved in all the discussions, really. We've made the point that we'd like to look at it at some point. I'm quite happy to leave it to the Chair and Vice Chair to look at when that might be in the future.
Right, okay, that's fine. So, I think, as we have had a long discussion about how funding will fit into the review, unless there are any outstanding questions about community hubs and how the rollout of the future model will be funded, can we move on to work plan and perhaps say goodbye to Maura and Charlie? Yes, Councillor Webb. Did you have an outstanding question?
Yeah, it's just the point 3 of the recommendations, agree a time frame.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Do we want to decide when this is going to come back? Because that might then inform our work plan a little bit. I personally think if we can't do any physical wandering about community hubs, and I think it would be really valuable for us to see other community hubs around the city. If we can't do that till the autumn, it might be worth sort of saying, I don't know, January 2022, will it be? I've lost track of years, but that might.
Are you suggesting that as a draft timescale to task and finish to have completed it by? Right. Yeah. So okay, so that's a good intention, isn't it? Yeah. Because okay, we've got the scoping reports. You can plan the work plan and then to be written up by January.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking, if other people think that seems sensible.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Maura and Charlie, do finish if you want to, or stay and listen to our work planning item. I'm really pleased that we've got a few minutes to look at our work plan. Because thank you, Charlie. Oh, he's gone. The next time this committee will meet in public and to discuss our work planning ideas amongst all of us isn't until July. So I would rather at least have something drafted now that we all are aware of and have agreed to. Now, I did email everybody a draft work plan, which would bring us up to September, October. Did everybody get it? You printed it out, Simon? Ah, I can't share my screen because it's on a different machine. So, Councillor Fitzpatrick.
Sorry, Chair, just to add somewhere in here, while it's still in my head, about Danesgate, if we could have the head of Danesgate here to talk about alternative provision and school transport and all those kinds of things, really. I mean, maybe not immediately. I mean, I don't know how soon.
No, well, hopefully it will be immediately. Hopefully, I will invite him.
I'm just thinking
on the 5th of May.
yeah, just thinking how busy schools are at the moment. But really, I think that's crucial to a lot of the stuff we were talking about in the financial report.
Definitely. And so the inclusion review, which is an item on the forward plan, will be talked to by Maxine Squire on the 5th of May. I will hope that Mark from Danesgate can come along as well. And we also have a list of 3 or 4 other key updates on SEND that have already been requested, to do with sufficiency and high needs and placement and mental health as well, actually, which will then hopefully lead into us having a bit of our meeting on the 5th of May to look over where we're up to with youth mental health, which myself and Fiona and Bob and Simon had a really good session on last week. Yes, Fiona?
Just to say that I think all of the things that you've mentioned there are big things, really. And I think we're in danger of, and sometimes I feel we do, try and get too many things in one session.
I know.
You know, really. When we don't do them service, if we push too many in there, really.
What I'm thinking of for the 5th of May is that it is a SEND focus because of the inclusion review. Now, I don't want to have a long discussion about the mental health. I was just going to bring forward where we're up to in terms of a scoping review from what we've already discussed on the mental health review, hopefully with some input from young people and health scrutiny, but it doesn't need to be a discussion item as such. Yes, Bob?
Cheers, Rosie. I think the I quite like the way it's all set out. The one thing I'd say about the 5th of May forum is I think it's really important that we separate out the inclusion review and SEND updates into 2 separate things.
Okay.
And I think you're right to say that presenting a very brief thing about youth mental health is important, just to say what we're doing and what's going on. But separating them out is really key, because the inclusion review is talking about children that might have all sorts of needs beyond educational needs, and about how they are best suited in school and in the school environment. And I just think it might work better for us from a questioning point of view if we did separate those into 2 items. They're certainly linked, of course, but just 2 bullet points rather than 1.
And Mark from Danesgate would be specifically talking about the inclusion review, I imagine.
Yeah, and it might be good to get, because obviously Mark from Danesgate is I don't want to say at the receiving end, but is typically going to be dealing with issues that are raised. Now the inclusion review also looks at, well, how is it that children are referred to Danesgate? Are they referred or not? So it might be worth asking if there's anyone from Schools Forum or something like that who could come along and talk about it as well.
Okay, thank you. Stephen?
Thank you. Just a suggestion for the June forum meeting, if we could have a sort of a specific work planning agenda item, given that it'll be our first meeting of the new municipal year. I think it'd probably be all helpful for us all to be on the same page in terms of understanding what we've got on in terms of ongoing reviews. We can sort of plug in, when we're due to receive the sort of the standing update in terms of monitor reports from York Learning and others. So we can sort of schedule all that in and then look at. There'll always be issues that will come up, either pre-decision scrutiny that we're asked to have a look at. But if we can use that meeting to try and sort of map out the year as best we can, that'll probably be a productive use of time.
It would be. Now, just before I gather your views about a topic other than work planning for our forum on June 7th, as you'll see, for the committee on 6th of July, I sort of made the executive decision that we should have a focus on youth services possibly request a youth justice service report on antisocial behaviour and start trying to form an agenda around holidays, youth provision, how it relates to the current issues with antisocial behaviour, and it being in a public committee forum as a public committee. I thought that might be a timely and really essential opportunity for us to address youth provision. I don't know if that is what everybody else would, we don't have to stick to it now, but that's why I did it that way round. But again, that's a discussion we need to have, isn't it? Is how do we decide what really should go to a public committee versus the topics that we then put in a forum? It is still quite difficult to make a call on that, as far as I'm concerned. Which is why I left the topics for June as a bit more open to either have a deeper dive into the many of the issues that Amanda was talking about earlier, and finally having a proper look at the permanent strategy and the foster carer recruitment strategy, or a totally separate issue about commissioning. I'm open to suggestions. Fiona?
I just think, yes, we might be interested in youth justice, but and we don't want young people going down that kind of path. But I think for youth services as a standalone anyway, with a positive slant before we start the summer holidays, is okay. I mean, because we're in a public forum, we don't want to be tarnishing it all as a problem before we even start. I mean,
and there's going to be lots of discussions about the antisocial behaviour long before then anyway, isn't there? So yeah, you're right. Okay, positive.
Yeah.
Okie dokie.
Yeah, I think on the holiday scheme as well. Obviously the government as you'll know, Rosie, the government's just released new funding.
Oh yes, I wanted to ask Amanda about that.
Well, I've been asking her all week about it. So
how good? Could you update us? The Holiday and Activities Fund.
So yes, so there's the Holidays and Activities and Food Provision Fund. Now, essentially, this is so York Council received 38,000, basically about, I don't know, a fortnight before the Easter holidays, and we're told, right, set something up, it'll all be fine. That, I mean, council officers have done a good job at trying to set something up, and it will be a good opportunity in July to look at what they did with that money at Easter.
Yes.
And how effective it was, because I think the way it works is 15% of that budget has to be food provision. So essentially what's going on is, so York City Football Club are providing activities, and they make sure there's a pack up waiting for the kids. It's things like that. But the plan is, and what is being planned right now, and I think possibly Maura would have been involved in that discussion, is how that the next tranche of money, because there's going to be further cash come to York, not a lot, but there will be more money come to York over the next 18 months for the holidays. And they're looking at how that is going to be spent. And hopefully by then, given that we will be able to be a bit more free, hopefully, not that children aren't free right now, to be honest, would make a bit of a difference. So yeah, so I can agree with her. July is just before the start of the summer holidays. It would be a good opportunity to both highlight and advertise what's going on, and maybe just add in a few little pointers from our points of view before we get into that summer. As for the ASB thing, is that linked into what's been going on in Micklegate, Rosie? Is that where that's come from?
And Holgate.
Oh, is it? I didn't know about that. Yeah, I think it's something that will come up, and we do need to review youth justice service. I don't know if it might almost be better as one of maybe at a private forum where we could maybe go into
Sure.
more depth, but I don't know.
Okay, yep, that's fine. Thank you. Councillor Fenton?
Yeah, just to say on that point, we've got housing and community safety. We're looking at it at a public meeting on the 19th, I think it is, of this month. So there may be, and and it's not going to be a kind of let's talk about youth. It's talking about the issue in its broadest sense. So things may come out of that in terms of if we get feedback from from the police and fire service that might provide us with some helpful pointers as to where they see some of the issues are and some of the the feedback they get from the conversations they're having, then we can feed that in terms of shaping what we might want to look at.
Thank you. That's good to know. And that's this month, isn't it, Stephen? So housing and community safety advert for the public committee later on this month. Bob?
Yeah, then in that sense, would it make sense to take that off our work plan and get an invite from us lot to maybe just even watch that meeting? Or and we've done it in the past, haven't we, Stephen, where there was an issue that affected both groups and we sort of just popped along, didn't we?
I think it was was it county lines? I think it was county lines.
Yeah,
Yes, it was.
So yeah, with this one, I hadn't thought about making it a sort of joint meeting, but if there was interest in that, then we could do that, or you could just watch it. It's up to you.
might save a bit of time if people were invited, and then because a lot of ASB is almost always targeted towards younger adults and teenagers and things like that. So I don't know, it might be an option rather than everyone going around the houses.
It's a good suggestion. It might not be, exactly how it doesn't have to be a formal joint scrutiny, but just to say that we've had this discussion at Children's, we'd like to have a seat round the table to kill two birds with one stone at your next meeting. Thank you, Angela, for saying you'll follow that up.
Yeah, I'm sure my Vice Chair, Councillor Pavlovic, won't object. So
thank you.
That sounds good to me.
Okay, so just so that I can just carry on looking at something for June, are people keen to, I say finally, but because when I started being chair of this committee, there was very many different strategies and papers that were on our work plan that never came to this committee regarding children and young people in care. Would we like to request the papers on the permanent strategy, foster care recruitment, placements? There was another one listed in the Financial Monitor, to actually to look at them in our forum and to say that we've seen them and have a discussion on, or do we feel that we've had enough discussion on those things now and the questions have been answered tonight? Bob?
We might not have received those reports, Chair, but we have certainly discussed a lot of the content of them. Might it be possible, Chair, for you to request for those particular reports that you're referring to be sent to committee members? And then when Councillor Fenton raised earlier the idea of having a separate work plan sort of item on the agenda at June, we could, if we've all read them, we could come with ideas and say, actually, no, this is a question I will answer. I mean, Councillor Heaton said earlier on about the permanent strategy and foster care recruitment. It might be that in order to move the conversation on a little bit, we almost need to just receive any information, have a look at it ourselves, and then come with ideas.
That's fine. And in that time, we'll have also received the biannual Safeguarding Partnership update report. So yeah, it's a good example of asking for some papers and doing background reading and then coming with any questions in our forum discussion. Okay, brilliant. Yep, that makes sense. Okay, thank you, everybody. and we've got lots to get on with. So thanks for all your time and all your inputs, and we'll keep discussions going. Yes,
Chair, can I just say something in case people wondered why I'm jumping about all over the place with my screen? My neighbour started drilling about half an hour ago, so I had to move to another room, and I'm balancing it on my hand, and I'm desperately trying to hide the fact that I'm actually in the bedroom and it might not be that tidy.
Well, do you know, thank you very much for your explanation, Fiona. I have no idea whether anybody's at home watching this, but for all of you, your time, and anyone else's, it's a good night from me, and speak to you again soon. Good night. Thank you.